As the Germans entered Stalingrad in 1942, they quickly realized one brutal fact. If they wanted to be alive 6 months from now, their best bet was to throw away their own MP-40 and grab the Soviet PPSh-41. This weapon was arguably the best small arms of the entire Second World War, firing over 900 rounds per minute, and has been featured in pretty much every World War II related movie and video game. Yet it turned the German experience at Stalingrad into absolute misery. But just a quick heads up before we get into it, the next 12 minutes will be quite violent, so now you're warned. Okay, so to understand why the PPSh-41 even existed, you have to go back to a humiliating beating the Soviets had just taken a year earlier. In late 1939, Stalin sent the Red Army into Finland thinking the whole war would be wrapped up in 2 weeks. Instead, a handful of Finns on skis ripped through Soviet columns with a submachine gun called the Suomi PP-31. These Finnish soldiers would slide out of the snowdrifts, empty a 71-round drum into a Soviet platoon, and vanish before anyone fired back. And it wouldn't take more than 3 months before 120,000 Soviet soldiers had died, and many of them never even saw the man pulling the trigger. So when Stalin finally pulled his army out, the lesson was burned into every Soviet general that they needed a cheap, ruthless, mass-produced submachine gun, and they needed it yesterday. And the man for the job would be Georgy Shpagin. Shpagin was a self-taught engineer who understood one thing better than anyone else in the room. The Soviet factories making weapons were about to get bombed to bits by the Germans, so whatever he designed had to be built by women and teenagers in unheated workshops using stamped sheet metal instead of carefully machined parts. His prototype was ready by autumn 1940, chambered in the small but scorching 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev round and fed from a 71-round drum borrowed straight from the Finnish playbook. The whole weapon was made of just 87 parts, and most of them were simple pressed steel pieces that a tractor factory could stamp out without any special tooling. It was officially adopted at the end of 1940, just 6 months before the Germans would launch the biggest invasion in human history. And it was during that invasion, the Germans would truly see the wrath of the PPSh submachine gun, as 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. The Red Army was caught carrying mostly bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles from the previous century. Entire Soviet armies were being wiped out or surrounded in pockets like Kiev, where roughly 600,000 men surrendered in a single encirclement. The Germans were taking 30 miles a day with their MP-40 submachine guns and MG-34 machine guns, chewing up anyone foolish enough to fight back in the open. But then the PPSh started arriving at the front in serious numbers, and everything began to change. Soviet factories had been hauled east on freight trains piece by piece, set up again beyond the Ural mountains where German bombers simply couldn't reach. And inside those frozen workshops, the PPSh-41 started coming off the line by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands, and eventually around 6 million by the end of the war. And as the Germans reached Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht was absolutely not ready for what was coming. The Germans entered Stalingrad in late August 1942, expecting the same quick collapse they had seen across half of Russia all summer long. What they walked into instead was a 5-month meat grinder where casualties got so high in some sectors that fresh replacements were being fed in faster than commanders could even count them. You see, Stalingrad wasn't fought on open fields where the German MP-40 and its slower 500 rounds per minute could keep its distance. It was fought inside apartment blocks, factory floors, basements, and sewer tunnels where 2 men might be standing on opposite sides of the same brick wall. In that kind of fight, the PPSh-41 turned every Soviet rifleman into a one-man fire team. The MP-40 fired around 500 rounds per minute from a 32-round magazine, while the PPSh fired over 900 from a 71-round drum. So a German soldier kicking down a door would get off maybe 3 or 4 short bursts before he ran dry. The Soviet on the other side of that door could hose the entire room down with 71 rounds in under 5 seconds and reload in less than 4 seconds. And this is exactly when German soldiers started doing something their own officers absolutely hated. They began stripping PPSh-41s off Soviet corpses and carrying them as their personal weapons. The Wehrmacht eventually gave the captured guns an official designation, 7.62mm Maschinenpistole 717R, with the R standing for Russisch, which simply meant Russian. Tens of thousands of these captured PPSh were officially reissued back to German troops, and some were even rebarreled to fire German 9mm parabellum so soldiers wouldn't run out of ammunition when Soviet supply dumps weren't around to be looted. Many of the men carrying them wrote home saying pretty much the same thing, that the only weapon they trusted inside a Stalingrad cellar was a captured Russian one. Now the reason this gun was so brutal in those tight spaces comes down to one detail most people overlook. The 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev round was a small, fast, vicious little bullet that left the PPSh's longer barrel at something close to 1,600 feet per second. At close range, it could punch straight through a German helmet and then through whoever was standing behind that helmet. But the real horror was the rate of fire combined with that drum. Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad would sweep a corridor in a wide arc and empty the whole drum at waist height, killing or wounding everyone in the room before the residue of smoke had even settled. When the German 6th Army finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, over 91,000 starving soldiers walked out of Stalingrad into Soviet captivity, and only about 5,000 of them would ever see Germany again. But while Stalingrad was being torn apart, another nightmare had been playing out 1,000 miles to the north. Leningrad had been sealed inside a German siege ring since September 1941. By the winter of 1942, over 1 million civilians inside that ring had already starved or frozen to death, and the few factories still operating were doing it with no coal, almost no spare metal, and barely any workers left alive. So inside this trapped city, an engineer named Alexei Sudayev was told to design something even cheaper than the PPSh. Leningrad simply did not have the materials to keep cranking out Shpaghin's weapon. What Sudayev came up with was the PPSh-43, and it might be the most overlooked weapon of the entire war. He stripped the design down to a fraction of the raw metal a PPSh required. He swapped the wooden stock for a folding metal one so paratroopers and tank crews could finally carry a real automatic weapon inside cramped hatches. The design was so brutally simple that starving workers were assembling PPS-43s inside the siege ring and handing them straight to soldiers heading for the front lines that same week. Soviet reconnaissance teams used these weapons to slip through German positions at night, raid supply depots, kill sentries on full automatic, and disappear before dawn. The folding stock made it the perfect tool for that kind of work because you could clip it under a winter coat and move through narrow trench corridors without snagging on anything. By the time the Red Army finally broke the Leningrad siege in January 1944, Sudayev's weapon had killed thousands of Germans in close-range raids that the bulkier PPSh simply could not have pulled off. About 2 million PPS-43s were eventually produced, though the PPSh remained the more common weapon because Soviet factories outside the siege had already tooled up for it. Together, these two guns gave the Red Army something the Wehrmacht never had at scale, which was an entire infantry doctrine built around mass automatic fire at close range. You'd see Soviet assault squads carrying nothing but PPShs and PPS-43s, no rifles at all, just walls of moving lead. And by 1944, those squads were leading every major Soviet offensive from Operation Bagration all the way to the streets of Berlin. But the strangest chapter of this whole story was still waiting in Berlin, where Germans and Soviets would end up gunning each other down with the exact same Russian weapon, which was both the PPSh-41 and PPS-43. By April of 1945, the Red Army had pushed across Eastern Europe and was standing at the gates of Berlin itself. What followed was the largest urban battle in human history, with around 2.5 million Soviet soldiers grinding through 1 million German defenders block by block, and the same close-quarters, submachine gun doctrine the Soviets had perfected at Stalingrad was about to be turned loose on the German capital. Soviet assault groups moved through the city in tight squads of 6 to 8 men, with a PPSh or a PPS-43 in the lead and a grenadier right behind. They cleared apartment buildings, the same way they had cleared the factory floors of Stalingrad, kicking in doors and hosing each room with the entire drum before moving on. The fighting got so vicious in places like the Reichstag that the same staircase might be cleared 3 or 4 times in a single afternoon. But the strange part of this whole battle was that the Germans defending those streets were sometimes carrying the exact same weapons. By this point in the war, the Volkssturm militia and the Hitler Youth had been handed whatever was left in the depots, including thousands of those rebarreled MP717R, PPShs the Wehrmacht had been hoarding since Stalingrad. So you would quite literally have a 14-year-old German boy in a doorway holding a Russian submachine gun rechambered for 9mm ammunition, firing it at a Soviet 30-year-old sergeant in the street holding the original Russian version of the same gun, which was absurd enough as it is. By the time Berlin surrendered on May 2nd, the city had killed over 80,000 Soviet soldiers and roughly 100,000 German defenders, with a huge share of those losses coming from the very weapon Spargan had stamped out of sheet metal back in 1940. But as the Second World War ended, the PPSh was just getting so incredibly outdated. By the time Soviet troops were storming the Reichstag in May 1945, every general in the Red Army had figured out one simple truth. A normal rifleman with a bolt-action Mosin couldn't keep up with a man carrying a PPSh, and a man carrying a PPSh couldn't reach past 200 meters with that tiny pistol round. What the Soviets needed was a single weapon that did both jobs at once, and the seed of that idea had already been planted by the PPSh itself. You see, back in 1943, Soviet officers had got their hands on a captured German weapon called the Sturmgewehr 44. This was the world's first true assault rifle, and it fired a shorter rifle round that hit harder than the Tokarev at distance, but was still controllable on full automatic. The Soviets had already proven through Stalingrad and Leningrad that mass automatic fire won wars, so they immediately went looking for their own version. The design competition that followed would take years, and the winner was a man almost no one in 1945 had ever heard of. His name was Mikhail Kalashnikov, a young tank sergeant who had spent most of the war recovering from wounds and thinking about exactly this problem. His weapon was finalized in 1947 as the Avtomat Kalashnikova, or AK-47, firing a new 7.62 by 39mm intermediate round at around 600 rounds per minute. It carried the PPSh's volume of fire into a real rifle's range, and it would eventually be produced over 100 million times, more than any other firearm in human history. The PPSh itself stayed in Soviet service well into the 1950s, then got shipped out by the millions to North Korea, China, and North Vietnam. American Marines in the Korean War complained bitterly about Chinese soldiers swarming their positions at night with PPSh, and they gave the weapon a nickname that would stick for decades, calling it the burp gun in 1940. If you'd like for us to cover more Soviet weapons, please subscribe to the channel.